Time here today and talk about purpose orbit, and I'm explain this, and hopefully it'll make sense to you, and you can see how to apply this. And I'll try to break this down as we go. I want to begin by just talking about leadership, the definition of leadership, and most of you have probably heard this. Maxwell is famous for saying it, that leadership is influence, and that is true, but it also entails much more than just influence. My personal favorite definition of leadership, and if you look up leadership, there is no one specific definition of leadership. There are hundreds of definitions of leadership. But my personal favorite is that leadership is a process whereby an individual leads people or others to achieve a common goal. And I like that definition for many different reasons. One, it incorporates the word that we usually hear, leadership is influence, but it also talks about achieving a common goal and influencing others towards that and the process whereby we do that. Another favorite definition was Richard and Henry Blackaby in Spiritual Leadership, outstanding book. If you've never read it, they give a definition for what they call spiritual leadership. And they say spiritual leadership is influencing people away from self-agenda towards God's agenda. And I like that definition for leadership because, again, it uses the word influence, but it has a goal or the common purpose, which is influencing people away from self-agenda towards God's agenda. So these are my two favorite definitions for leadership. The challenge that I hear many leaders that they face is, how can I get people to pick up the task or the responsibilities that they have been entrusted with or given or they want to assume responsibility for, and then stay with it to actually accomplish, to get done the things that they need to get done. And I want to try to help answer that question. It's interestingly, the overwhelming evidence is that people do want to contribute. People do want to be successful. People want to work hard, and they feel good when they do so. They want to achieve common goals, and yet many people that want to do such things are not as fully engaged as they probably could be. So the question is, why? Why is this so? And is there anything that we can, as leaders, do to address this issue? And I believe that there are many possibilities and possible answers to this question. I'm going to attempt to focus on one particular aspect, and I want to, in focusing on that, ask this question. The question is, what are we actually calling people to orbit around? That's the question. And I think that the answer to this question can help us in trying to get people on board, to stay with things, to move forward, to align ourselves with what pure leadership is. Now, you notice, and I'll come back to this towards the very end, that in the definition of leadership, I didn't say that leadership was a position. The reason is that you can have a position or a title and be called a leader and not have influence. It's amazing. I'll talk about these things over and over and over again, and yet I repeatedly run into, it seems as though a lot of younger leaders, after saying these things over and over again, that I will find out through the grapevine or hear something being said in which they are, I need a position so I can tell people what to do, so they'll respect me. And I'm like, you've totally missed what leadership is about. Recently, I ran into an individual that is quite older than me that said the same exact thing. I need the position so people will respect me so I can tell them what to do. And so it is true that with a title, with a position comes a certain amount of authority that you can tell people what to do, and especially on jobs. But that is the poorest level of leadership. The purest form of leadership is that of influence. So you can find someone who actually is a leader who does not have a title or a position, they just have influence. Hopefully, they're influencing people in the right direction. If you can find those people that are on your team or in your church or within, if you're a youth director, within your youth team, you can find the people of influence and build relationships with those people and allow them to have buy-in, then you gain a lot of traction in leading and moving forward. I shared this yesterday as a new leader at a church. I was a family pastor and working with about 150 young marrieds. I was the new guy, and I had not had the time needed to build influence. Interesting, let me just interject. Do you know what the average tenure of a pastor is? It's 4 years. And yet we also say that you don't really become the pastor until after 5 or 7 years. It's interesting that a lot of guys stop pastoring at 4 years before they ever become the pastor. And many times because we're frustrated in leading, and yet leadership is influence, and it takes time to develop that. So as a new leader in assuming a new responsibility, I found the person who had the influence. And the person had been the former youth pastor for 11 years. So he knew most of the young marrieds. And I asked him to be a part of the team. We became very good friends. And I gained a lot of respect and influence in moving forward because he was a part of the team. So leadership really is influence. So the question is, what are we calling people to orbit around? Let me just illustrate what happened a few years back. I was asked by two pastors to come in and to counsel a couple. And they had connections to this couple. Neither one were the pastor. The couple had left the church where they were at, but they had good connections to them in the past, and they wanted to do what they could to help this couple. So I stepped on the scene, did not know the couple. Found out a little bit of the history. The man had actually committed adultery 18 months prior. For 8 months, they had been separated, living in 2 separate cities. Not hardly talking to each other, both of them trying to attend some churches a little bit, and I was asked to come into this situation and try to counsel them. So as you know, that when someone walks in and they sit down on opposite ends of the couch and kind of turn their shoulders to one another, you know things are not good. They didn't even sit on the same couch. He sat on one end of the couch, she sat in a chair over this direction. She would not look at him. He began to talk, and he began to explain that he had made some major mistakes in his life and that he had repented, and it had happened a year and a half previous, and he was ready to move forward. And I kind of got the feeling and listened to him talk that he kind of felt as though that I've already done everything I can do. It's time to move on. And as I began to talk with the lady, she didn't talk much at all, but as I began to talk with her, I began to realize that in her mind, in her heart, things, she had somewhat forgiven him, somewhat, but she did not trust him, and she did not know what to do to move forward. So I met with them and spent about an hour and a half. It didn't go well. I got up and walked out of there and thought, man, I don't know if I can do anything to help this couple. Met with them a week later, and the same thing. It had not changed. I could not get her to talk much. And finally, after about 45 minutes in the session, I walked over and I got a chair, and I just felt inspired by the Lord. And I got a chair, and I set it in the middle of the office, and I said, I want to ask you a question. I said, who is supposed to be sitting in this chair? And I looked at the man and I said, this is what I see. I see you saying that I have said I'm sorry repeatedly. I've tried to do what is right. I've tried to move on with things. I'm living for the Lord, and you just need to get over it. You just need to move on with it. And I said, I see you sitting in the chair, and you're asking your wife to orbit around you. And I said, and ma'am, I see you sitting in this chair. And I said, I see you saying that, well, I've forgiven him, but I don't trust him. We never really have dealt with the issue the right way. And I don't, I'm not budging. And I said, so I see you sitting in the chair and you're asking your husband to orbit around you. I said, my question is, who is supposed to be the one sitting in the chair? And then I said, can I ask you a question? And the man said, yes. And I said, do you love God? And he said, yes. I said, do you love him with everything? He said, yes. I said, do you love him enough that if you guys got back together and she just, every time you come home, she's just mad at you and your life is just a life of misery, you're still going to love God, live for God, do what's right? He goes, absolutely. I said, ma'am, do you love God? She said, yes. I said, do you love him so much that if you get back together and he has another affair in 5 years from now, you're still going to forgive? And you may not stay, you may not reconcile as far as staying together as a couple, but you will forgive and you will still love God, you'll live for God, you're not going to be a bitter person. She said, absolutely. And when they both said that, I stood up, clapped my hands together, and I smiled, and I said, congratulations, you guys. And he's sitting on the end of the couch, she's sitting in the chair. I said, you guys are going to have a wonderful marriage. And they just looked at me, kind of like, what? And today, they have an incredible marriage. An incredible marriage. And so the question is who is going to sit in the chair? When I see that in my mind's eye, going back, this was some years ago, from that time forward, I've seen that same kind of scenario replay itself over and over again. Churches are notorious for silos. And being an Indiana boy, growing up in a farm town, my grandfather pastored the church that my brother now pastors. My grandfather was a farmer, and I played in many silos. But it seems to me that many churches are silos. You have this department, this ministry, that ministry, and they all seem to function and operate within themselves, and there's not a tremendous amount of collaboration or working together, and you end up finding many times that these silo ministries are vying for space within the church, meeting rooms. They're vying for the same personnel. They're vying for a place on the calendar for dates, and there's all of this friction going on. And I remember one particular time when an individual stopped by my office and knocked on my door, and I looked up, and they looked at me and they said, I have a bone to pick with you. And I turned around and I said, what's wrong? And they said, you're taking the people out of my ministry, and I need them. And I said, I'm not taking anybody out of your ministry. And they said, well, this such and such couple came to me and they said they can't serve because they're involved in your area of ministry, and you told them not to. And I said, I did not tell them not to. I said, what I told them was that they were involved in too many ministries. I said, this particular couple are involved in 9 ministries. They're a young married couple. I said, the husband told me just a week ago that he is less spiritual today than he was 2 years ago. And I said, and I began to realize something. I said, activity does not equal spirituality. And I said, they're too busy. And I said, I told them that they needed to find out what exactly it was that God had called them to do and to zero in on that and to let some things go. And I said, I didn't tell them what to choose. And he said, well, you're taking people from our ministry, and went right back into it again. And I just stopped and I said, I just want to say something. I said, you and I, we're on the same team. We're trying to accomplish the same thing. I said, I need you to succeed. If you don't succeed in your area of ministry and things move forward, I said, it's going to hurt this particular area of the family dynamic. And we are on the same team. I said, furthermore, I want you to know that our family loves you. And I said, we have gleaned so much from you. And I went down this list of things. And I said, so we're on the same team. I said, and then, what Brother Woodward just talked about, if you know my personality, you know that I am not this guy. But push me enough, I'll become this guy. And I just spoke up and I said, don't ever walk back to my office again and tell me that you have a bone to pick with me. I said, we're on the same team. And the individual looked at me, and I give him great respect. I love this individual. They looked at me and they said, I appreciate you speaking straight to me. I like that, and I'll never do it again. We're on the same team. And from that day forward, for several years, we worked together like this. And I really appreciate and honor and love that individual. So the question is, how do you get everybody on the same page? How do you get everyone going in the same direction? And the statement that I am kind of moving towards and trying to make the point here, and I'm going to try to show how this can be applied in many different ways, is that what you call people to orbit around, it matters. What are you calling people to orbit around? What is the goal? What is the purpose? I would suggest that it's not about you. It's not about you. It is not about you. So the question is who is going to sit in the chair if it's not about you? Now, the buzzword today is servant leadership. And servant leadership, there's a lot of great value to be found in servant leadership. We know that Jesus took the towel, he served, he said we're to serve. And yet, I'm also very leery of servant leadership, and you're not going to hear a lot of people say that. I made the kind of statement that I just made to you when I was in my doctorate program, and I made it to an individual who happens to be like a world expert in servant leadership, and my goodness, did I get, she fired back so fast, and Brother Coltharp is in the same program. He probably knows who I'm talking about right now, but she fired back so fast and shot me down that I thought, well, I'm not going to tackle that again. But I went back to studying and looking at things closer, and the more I did, the more I became convinced in what I had felt. And that is that there's a motivation for all the different types of leadership skills or theories. Charismatic leader, there's a lot of value there, but you can take it and do the wrong thing with it. The motivation for a charismatic leader is himself. It's my vision, what I see, what I want to do. And if it's a good thing, then you applaud it. If it's not a good thing, it's not so good. So that's the motivation of a charismatic leader. The motivation of a servant leader is others. There's some value there, but what do you do if, going back, illustration, the old Wild West, and you've got the people who are upset because the sheriff has got the guy in the jail who was the horse thief, and now they're out front of the jail, and they're demanding, let him go. We want to go, hang him. And the sheriff steps out there and draws his guns and says, you're not going to do this. He's not necessarily serving the wants or the desires of the people. He's serving the common good. He knows that there is value in the law and order. So if you study leadership theories, you'll find out that what I am talking about right now is what you would call a transformational leader. The motivation of a transformational leader is the organization. So as Christian leaders, we serve others, but our goal is not just others. There are people who right now who are so given to doing whatever everybody else wants to do, and sometimes you got to step up and say, you know what, that's not the right way. The scripture says this is what God is saying, and this is the way we need to go. And that is not what you would say necessarily a servant leader. So we serve others, but our serving others comes from our serving Him. And we're always aligned with His purpose, His will, His design in our serving others. So this would be what you would call a transformational leader. So anyway, moving on from that, what you're trying to call people to orbit around, what is the purpose? What is that? I want to suggest something to you, and that is that there is a difference between being value-driven and performance-driven. And I want to go back to something I talked about yesterday, so those of you that were in here yesterday, please pardon some of the repeat of this, but your philosophies determine your values. Your values determine your behavior. Your behavior will generate your destination. I made the statement yesterday, and I firmly believe this. You give me enough time around someone, I can tell you what their future looks like because their behaviors are dictating their future. You can just tell. And so if you can find out what their behaviors are, then you can begin to recognize what their values are. And if you find out what their values are, in order to really understand where those values are coming from, you have to understand their mindset, their philosophy. So if you don't like the direction you're headed, you've got to look at your behaviors, then you got to analyze your values, and then you got to be able to ascertain what are those philosophies. Several years ago, some of you have probably heard this story, but Brother D.G. Hargrove, pastor in Garland, Texas, a wonderful a leader, and got to spend some quality time with him as we were based now there for a while. And he shares the story of what he calls the open hand philosophy. And the open hand philosophy was that years ago he was pastoring in Colorado, and he went to visit a lady who was dying. And he saw her take her last breath, and when she did this. She opened up her hands. And he said the Lord spoke to him and said, I want to take you to a higher level. He said, but you've got to be willing to open up your hands. He said he was so moved by that he went to the church and spent the next several hours praying and talking with the Lord. And the Lord began to put into him some values, some things, some philosophies, some ways of seeing things that changed his life. He said it wasn't but just like a month or so later that an individual who was the right-hand man at the church came to him, and it was a small church that he was planning, and this individual came to him and said, Pastor, he said, my wife and I are going to be leaving and going elsewhere. And he said, and my first response was to go like, no, let's talk about this and try to get the man to stay. And he said, the Lord spoke to me and says, remember the law of the open hand. And he said, I just said, well, brother, I want to help you. Anything that we can do to help you in this transition, I want to help you. And he said, in the back of my mind, I'm going like, no. And he said the man left, and he said it was just a few weeks later, there was a knock at his office door, and he opened the door, and the FBI agents are standing there inquiring about this individual who had left. And he said, we understand that he goes to your church. He says, no, he doesn't go here. And come to find out, the man and his wife had been embezzling money at their company, and it made a front page news in the town that he was pastoring in. And he said, I was so thankful for the open hand philosophy. Years later, pastoring in Dallas, the church began to grow. And there was an individual who did not align themselves and did not agree with the direction the church was going. They were getting ready to build a brand new building. This individual did not want them to build a building, wanted to stay in the old building. And after every service, the man would come to Pastor Hargrove and would talk with him and be upset and express his displeasure. And finally one day, and you have to know, Pastor Hargrove was like 5'4" or 5. He was real small. And this guy is a big Texan. And finally one day, the guy comes in his office and throws his keys down. He's yelling. He says, I quit. I'm no longer the usher. You can have my job in ministry. I'm done with this. And he said, before I knew it, I stood up and I walked around. He said, brother, and he picked up the keys. And he said, brother, he said, I'm not going to accept your resignation. He said, God put us together. He said, we're going to have to work together. He said, here's your keys. I expect you on in your position and your duties in the next service. And he said when he did that, this big old burly Texan had a tear begin coming out of his eye. And he said, Pastor Hargrove, he said, you are a bigger man than I am. Now, both of those stories are illustrating the same exact value of the open hand. Both of them. Because it's not about me. Most of us, our human nature is that when someone does that, okay, you go ahead and take you just get on out the door. I'm not going to put up with you. Instead, Brother Hargrove's like, no, sir, we're going to work together. Again, that's the open hand. And he said that about 5 or so years later, this man was dying. And they went to his house, and he had cancer, and he sent everyone out of the room. And he called Pastor Hargrove over to his bedside and motioned to him, and he leaned down and he whispered, he said, thank you for what you did. He said, if you hadn't done what you did in your office some years ago, he said, I would be on my way to hell. Open hand. This is the difference between performance and values. Values. I could go on. I want to share some more illustrations concerning values to help us to understand what we mean when we talk about values. Pastor Hargrove began teaching these values and these philosophies that then create the right kind of values. He said that I was at a dinner table with him. I just met him and a few others, and I'm sitting at the dinner table, and this man says, Pastor, he said, you guys are a value-driven church. He said, yes. He said, we want to be a value-driven church. He said, do you have problems? Pastor Hargrove went, no. He goes, oh, come on, man. He said, everybody has problems. He said, I can't think of any. He said, come on. He said, you got problems. And he went, no. He said, oh, there is Sister Sue. And when he said, there is Sister Sue, they started laughing. Now I'm the new guy on the block, just arrived. There's 5 ministers, and I knew instantly that Sister Sue, because these guys pastored elsewhere around the town, I knew that everybody knew who Sister Sue was in Dallas. And so that told me that Sister Sue is someone who jumps around and kind of a problem. And he said, there is Sister Sue. He said, he said here just a few weeks ago, he said, my wife was walking through the kitchen, and Sister Sue was having a conversation with another lady in the church. And this lady in the church does not have a position. Her husband doesn't have a position. They're not pastors in the church, just someone there in the church. And my wife was walking in the back area of the kitchen, and they didn't see her. And she overheard Sister Sue say, let me tell you about the church that I used to go to. And she said that when that happened, this lady responded back. She said, sister, she said, we don't do that here. We don't do that here. He said in 20, I think it's 22, 23 years at the time, he said, I've never had to preach against gossip. He said, we don't have that issue. He said, I don't even have to. He said, they're calling one another into alignment. He said, because this is just a value that we have. So those values, we can be so performance-driven and not be value-driven. Now, there's nothing wrong with performance. There is always a certain amount of performance in everything we do. But what about the value? I gave the illustration yesterday at church I went to, and they asked me to meet with their leaders, met with them, and I asked them, I said, if you were to describe your church in such a way that, say you ran into somebody at Walmart and they asked you or said to you that, you know what, I really like your church. Would you respond, oh, A, who did you meet from our church? B, when did you see our building? Or C, what church service did you attend? And I said, what would be your response? And I said, and I went around the room, and all 18 of them answered the same thing. The answer was, what church service were you a part of? And I said, I understand that because I've seen your behaviors. I said, you all put a lot of emphasis on the church service. I said, it's, come on, let's get with it from the very beginning. As the guy walks up the pulpit, bless God, we're going to have a great Sunday today. Let's all stand and lift our voices and our hands to heaven. And as he's got the preacher voice, I said, you guys give great value to having a great church service. I said, there's only one problem with that. I said, the signs on the way in and throughout the sanctuary say, whole families made whole. I said, you're trying to project that your value is families. I said, but you guys don't value families. I said, you value a great church service. And I said, no, a great church service is important. I said, but you probably ought to take down your signs that say whole families made whole. I said, because you guys don't value families, and I can prove it from your behaviors. And I began to talk to the individuals in charge of the administration and the music. And I said, sir, you were 20 minutes late for practice today. You ran the practice up until time church starts. The people are so used to this that they're coming 15 minutes late. Visitors are walking in on time, but the church people are not here. You get done from your practice. You have your holy huddle in which you have your little prayer meeting. Everyone goes to the water fountains, comes back in. No one shakes the hands of the guests. And you go right up to the pulpit, and the young guy walks up there to start the service. Bless God, let's stand and lift our hands to heaven. I said, you guys value having a great church service. You don't value families. So values, we're talking about values. If you want to know what you really truly value, look at your behaviors. Your behaviors will reveal what your values are. It doesn't matter what you say. So my little session here today, I'm not advocating that